Maroon 5 obviously is gratifying because I got to work with a band that was unknown on an unknown label, and they just blew up and became a worldwide hit. I mean, I remember having friends who were touring in different countries during that time, and I'd get these like emails like, "Oh, we were in the airport in Sydney, Australia, and we heard This Love." And then someone's like, "Yeah, I'm in Amsterdam, I'm hearing This Love." It's like, oh, that's really something.
Greetings, everyone. This is Eric Henry Anderson, and welcome to Conversations for Convergence, a curious podcast exploring myriad topics, including music and the arts, health and wellness, culture, science, high performance, and many others. Today's guest is Matt Wallace. Matt is an American record producer who has worked with a plethora of artists during his 4-decade career, including Maroon 5, Faith No More, Train, The Replacements, Sheryl Crow, O.A.R, Andy Grammer, and John Hiatt, just to name a few. Wallace has produced most of Faith No More's most iconic recordings, including We Care a Lot, their debut album on Mordam Records. Wallace also produced and mixed Songs About Jane, the debut album for Maroon 5, including the top 40 hit singles Harder to Breathe, This Love, Sunday Morning, and She Will Be Loved. The album has sold over 10 million copies worldwide and won a Grammy Award for Best New Artist in 2005. In this episode, Matt and I discuss the early days of recording Faith No More in Matt's parents' garage, how the music industry has changed over the years and become much more isolated and less collaborative, the reduction of shared experience in music and culture today, how Maroon 5 and Songs About Jane fell into Matt's lap and the chance he took on the band, the massive worldwide breakout success of Songs About Jane, producing Shattered and co-writing with O.A.R, Matt's goal as a producer of pulling the best out of each artist, recording with Train, the hardest working band he's ever seen, the propaganda machine on the extreme ends of the political spectrum, adventures in immersive audio by Apple and remixing stereo tracks for Dolby Atmos, the primacy of a great song over audio fidelity, and many other topics. Aside from being a talented and accomplished record producer, Matt just happens to be an all-around awesome guy who I've had the pleasure of working with in my former band, The Novelists. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Matt Wallace as much as I did. All right, Matt, how are you doing?
Pretty darn good. Had a lovely breakfast with a delightful fellow.
Yes, it was a great breakfast. Thanks for suggesting the spot.
Thank you for treating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really great to be back here at Studio Deluxe, right?
Studio Deluxe,
where
the Revel. Sorry, I was going to say this other band I just worked with, where the Novelists recorded.
Indeed. So about is it 3 years ago? Has it already been 3 years?
I hate to admit that it's that long ago.
Absolutely wild. So anyway, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. Yep. Just so many questions as we're having a great breakfast, and there's so little time and so much to talk about.
There is. It's true. It's true.
But maybe you could just we can start by you giving our listeners a little bit of a background. Certainly, I'm familiar with your work. Right. We've worked together, but tell them a little bit about how you got into recording and some of the artists you've worked with, and kind of how that all started.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm a Capricorn, and I like long walks on the beach and talks by a fireplace. No, I started when I was 13. I was in bands, and I just was really drawn to like heavy, ugly music like Black Sabbath and even like the early Lynyrd Skynyrd record and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But also was really drawn to pop radio. So I guess my things that have influenced me have always been pretty eclectic. So I kind of frame the work I do between the brutal and the beautiful. And so sometimes it's heavy, ugly, masculine, testosterone-driven angst stuff, and then other times it's more melodic and more on the feminine side and more kind of delicate and beautiful. So that's kind of what I do. But yeah, I was just in bands. I was the nerdy guy that would record our bands, and that was kind of how I got started. Then I ultimately built a studio in my parents' garage, ostensibly to make my own record, which has never, ever happened. So once I built a studio, my friends knew about it. So of course, they wanted to come in and check it out, and they wanted me to record them. So I started doing that, and then recorded a lot of different bands, Bay Area bands. The only one that's going to be of any notoriety is a band called Faith No More that recorded in their early incarnation of my parents' garage. So that's kind of what got me sort of started.
So Faith No More was the first band that had a lot of success that kind of got your career going.
Yes, yeah, it was, yeah.
And you've worked on a number of Faith No More records,
I did everything that they ever did from their first demos when they were called Sharp Young Men. Then they became Faith No Man. And we did a 7-inch single, then they became Faith No More. So, but yeah, the original rhythm section, Mike Borden and Bill Gould actually recorded in my parents' garage in 81 or 82. We were all students at UC Berkeley, so So yeah, I met them and we just made some recordings. And after that, things kind of slowly took off. And the nice thing about working with that band is that I was really happy to have my first blush of success, my first gold and platinum record with them, because I feel like we all kind of grew up together. We all learned together. It was really gratifying to be working with people that I had worked with since my parents' garage days, and then had success with them. So that was really lovely.
That's amazing. So, I mean, this is certainly a question that can go in so many different directions, but we were talking about at breakfast this morning how much the music industry has changed. I mean, it's almost unrecognizable, really, from where it was 30 years ago. I mean, what are some of the ways that you've seen it change that I guess have been the most profound? And I mean, just how do you think about the Matt Wallace that was starting as a record producer and as an engineer back in, was it the 80s?
Yeah, early.
And where is it now?
Well, I mean, that's a question that can be answered in many, many different ways. I think bands and musicians can answer it very differently than I would. For them, a lot of their money is made from touring now, which is very different. But for me, the biggest change is that I think a lot of my peers will agree with me, and that is not to be too glib or too, annoying. But basically, I think a lot of the fun and a lot of the money kind of left the business over the last 10, 15 years. In the olden days, there was enough money and budgets where you can actually work in like real recording studios, and you'd bump into your peers. Everyone's working on their own different project, and you'd be able to say, "Hey, come check this out, see what I'm working on," or "Hey, listen to my mix." And so it was really nice. There was a lot more, camaraderie, and there was just more. It felt more communal to me. And nowadays, the biggest change is that everyone I know has their own studio. Right. And so all of us work in our own garage or our own house. And so you don't really get that kind of camaraderie where you get to bump into people and exchange ideas and see what everyone's up to. And it's really a much more isolated and honestly a more lonely business than it used to be.
And the pandemic, I'm sure, has only accelerated that too.
The pandemic has accelerated, but even before that, even at the era when I was working more on analog, or even at the beginning of the fledgling early days of digital, I'd be mixing and recording. Even if I was mixing, I'd be in a place where the band would show up. And we'd listen and we'd check it out and say, that sounds great. Come back in a couple hours and I'll change the mix. I've in the last 2, 3, 4 years, I've done, for better or for worse, I've done a bunch of international mixing for people in Denmark and Brazil and, Hong Kong, all around the world, Canada, and never even meet people. So I could actually have worked with someone, pass them on the street and not even know who they are because
it's wild, isn't it?
So all communication. In fact, most of the time I don't even speak to them. It's all via
it's
email.
Like here's the mix 4 notes. Like please turn the vocal up here and
so there's no voice. Like I wouldn't even recognize if someone called me on the phone and they'd be like, "Hey, it's me." I'm like, "Who?" "Well, I'm so and so from this band." It's like, "Oh, I would have never recognized your voice because I don't know your cadence. I don't know the timbre of your voice. I don't know your sense of humor."
It's just bizarre, isn't it?
It's and coming from a place where everything in music was very, very much in a room with people,
synergistic, organic,
and even just recording like multiple people at once. Nowadays, it is kind of multiple monaural recording, like one thing at a time. So
it's all done isolated and it's all multi-tracked. I
very,
remember
very
talking
different.
to my roommate about that recently, because I'll just like you were saying, I also have sort of a home studio set up. It's certainly it's nothing glorious, but for vocal tracking and things like that, I can get it done. But I was talking to my roommate about this, and he was actually quite dumbfounded to understand how a recording is actually made. And it's certainly in modern times, everything's just isolated and it's multi-tracked. Obviously, multi-track recordings go back many decades, but at least you'd be in a situation like you're saying where you're in there with the band and you're tracking the drums and everybody's kind of there. It's oh man, that was the take, And it's just so bizarre, right? Because like we were talking about before, you have this technology, which on the one hand, it's a beautiful thing that you can record for somebody who, for example, lives in Europe, right? And you can send them WAV files over the internet. But at the same time, this sort of experience that we're having, this was sort of like missed a little bit, right?
It is. And one of the things I think not too many people are aware of, and that is one of the biggest differences in modern recording is that no instruments today move any air except for the voice. Like guitars, with the speakers moving air and you record it, that's all, you can do your plug-in, you have guitar amp simulators and stuff like that. You just go directly in. No drum kits, like you don't hit a snare drum and the sound moves through the air in the room and the microphone captures it. nowadays, and so you can have stuff that has you've got great drum samples.
Yeah.
You can program a drummer. All your piano things. No one mics up a piano anymore, and so there is really no air movement
except me. So sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes. But no, you're right. And in a lot of situations, it's truly unnecessary. The only reason I'll do it sometimes as a piano player on certain songs, there's certain situations where it's truly you're not getting anything out of it. Yeah. But it's not even the sound for me. It's actually the playing of the instrument. But it's also it's something that I like to do because it's fun. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
It's
Yep.
Yeah.
But there's no air movement, and and so the good news is that anybody can record an album in their bedroom because of the technology, and the bad news is that anybody can record an album in their bedroom because of the technology.
Right.
And so the thing is like, I can record a song and put it up on Spotify, and the last statistic I heard is that Spotify. Do you know how many songs a day Spotify gets uploaded?
Gets uploaded? Oh my goodness, I don't even. It's just a guess. I'm sure it's an astronomical number.
Well, the last thing I heard was 40,000 songs a day.
Wow.
So the good news is you can put stuff up on Spotify. The bad news is that nobody's ever going to find it because there's such a flurry of music. There's so much. There's such an abundance, which in some ways is very, very, very good, that anybody can express themselves. But the negative thing is that there's no one, like record labels, for better or for worse, at least would kind of funnel certain artists. So we would hear about, whatever artist is out there that we like, we would hear because the label would push it and promote it. So you go, I like that music. I want to hear that artist or that band. And nowadays, it's harder for most musicians, I think, today because it's so much more competition. And by the way, fewer and fewer live venues.
Totally, yeah. And as you're saying, with the technology being a double-edged sword, it is, I mean, there's barriers to entry are lower, but there's a deluge of stuff. Some of it's fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
But there's a whole lot of garbage out there as well, and not even necessarily to put a judgment on like this stuff is good and this stuff is bad, but there's just the sheer volume is insane. And one of the things that this might be an interesting segue into some of the discussions we had this morning, but music is one example of this. Right. But the same is true with podcasting, television, whatever it is. We all have the ability, for better and worse, to create exactly the reality we want. And it's beautiful on the one hand, but it also, we don't have the same type of shared experience we have anymore. And if you think about what's happening in this country and around the world in a political sense, it's driving people apart too, because you can find your version of confirmation bias. I mean, you can find somebody who's very smart, soundingly at least, that's going to tell you exactly what you want to hear about reality. But it is a little bit of tangent, but it's similar, I think, to what's happening in the music industry.
It's very, very, very different.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also different for bands. I think there was a time when you could get songs placed, and that was, a little bit easier and certainly more lucrative. And I think from what I've heard from artists and bands, and that is, it's getting more difficult to do it when you do get
play songs.
Play songs, And now when you do get stuff placed, I think the biggest thing is that. In the olden days, you'd get a pretty nice upfront fee, but also you'd be able to keep your publishing. And I've talked to a number of people who say, the upfront fees are lower, and you actually sign off on your publishing going into it. So the chance of getting residuals or royalties has actually been diminished. So I think there's been a diminishment of the value of music. Basically, we've been kind of just going in that direction since, let's say, 2000.
Right.
It just has been going down and down, where music has just become a commodity where people can get it for free and don't really need to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, I can actually speak to that with some personal experience, too. About almost 10 years ago now, I actually wrote some music for a TV show that was on the CW. Right. And it was a show called Safe 3. It wasn't like some huge show, but it was, all around the world. And I, made a few $1,000s. I mean, it was a pretty decent royalty for like one placement. Right. Recently did some music for, you're not going to believe me, this is true, though, for the remastered version of Baywatch. And it went on Amazon. Right. The royalties so far have been maybe enough to pay for the breakfast we had this morning. Right. I mean, it's because Amazon streaming, the amount of money you get from the streams is like infinitesimal. Or like with the amount of money, I heard that Pharrell Williams, the song Happy was the biggest song by whatever metric in 2015, and apparently his Spotify royalties were like $5,000 or something like that from that song, which is like unthinkable. You're like, wait, what? Yeah. Then you think about independent artists; they're making nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you make 0.004 or 0.0004 cents per I know for YouTube, and it might be the same thing for Spotify stream. So you have to have tremendous numbers, and those who do make it get up into the 500 million or a billion, you can make some really good money, but but there's very few people who get to that.
Yeah, no kidding.
That level.
Yeah. Again, it's just there's such a benefit to the technology, right? But there's also downsides. And one of the things I've noticed, which I'm sure you've experienced too, is like, everybody and their brother who buys a MacBook Pro is a producer now.
Yeah.
Which dilutes the term for somebody like yourself who actually is like a legitimate producer who is, and it's not. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of those people are incredibly talented and great that they can actually get into it that way. But again, it's just a deluge of like,
And I think, look, if someone has a MacBook Pro and they are putting together music, I think they are a producer. I don't think there's any. I don't have any problem with that at all. I think that's just how it is, And but just there's a lot more people doing it now, which means that it's not as specialized of a job, and there's and people are willing to do it for less and less money, which means that the chance of making a living just kind of diminishes.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. Speaking of production too, as I'm looking at some of this like wonderful outboard gear, but people that are teenagers now that are learning to mix on the Logic Pro right from their laptop. They have all these plugins that are digital recreations of all of this stuff. Yeah. But somebody from your generation, and even kind of as I started to get into the music industry, you still are kind of learning how everything works based on the analog gear. And it's anyway, I don't really have much of a point there other than it's just really interesting because what they're growing up doing is all based on plugins.
Yeah.
So
it is. Yeah, I think there's things do get a little homogenized when everybody's kind of got the same kind of plugins and they all kind of sound the same. Whereas analog gear, like all my equipment, even similar piece of gear is gonna sound different.
Right.
I've got two 1176s. They both sound a little different. I've got a couple of Neve preamps. They sound a little different. So there is a more variability, I think, in some of the sounds and less of a predictability.
Right.
And sometimes you'll have a piece of gear that starts kind of not working very well. It might sound really, really good before it blows up, and you get a great sound out of it. Whereas, the plugins, you and I are going to have the same plug-in, it's going to sound exactly the same.
And maybe that piece of gear that's on its way out, you get it just in time to get that record done, and then you can never make a drum recording, for example, that sounds exactly like that. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I've had that with guitar amplifiers. When they right before they blow up, they sound amazing. They blow up here. Well, I guess we're done with that. So we're done with those overdubs.
Yeah. So speaking of production, you have worked on. You've had fantastic career so far. Worked on some of the biggest records, really, in pop rock music history. So you started with Faith No More, and can you tell us a little bit about how did your progression go? Because you don't just all of a sudden arrive one day, producing Maroon 5, for example. Like there's a progression that.
Well, the progression was really interesting. By rights, I'm not sure if I even had the credentials to do Maroon 5. I'm not really sure, because my most notorious band was Faith No More up to that point in time. I had some other stuff I'd worked on,
which is very different than
Maroon
it is.
5. Yeah, and I did some Sheryl Crow stuff, and I did various other artists, but I just think that I love the music, and I was tenacious. Nile Rodgers was actually offered the gig, and he would have done a really great job, but when he was told what the budget was, because it was an indie label, he goes, I can't make a record for that kind of money.
So Songs About Jane was on an indie label?
Yeah, it was started on Octone Records.
Really?
No, there's a record
Holy
label.
Cow.
Okay, here's the scoop. Octone Records, which had never put out a record before.
Yeah.
Put together by some guys who had worked in the business, and they got some seed money from some investors. But that was unheard of band, unknown label, unknown manager. Everything about that was stacked against it. I was actually offered another gig with a band called Days of the New that were pretty popular early in the 90s. And they were on like Columbia. They had a big pile of money. They had a nice recording studio. I was offered twice as much money to produce their record.
Holy cow.
And I took a 50% pay cut to work with Maroon 5 to produce it, and I even mixed it basically for free because there just wasn't much money in it. So I took it was the biggest long shot I've ever taken, but I just believed in those songs, and I was just I was like, well, like I know my friend said, first of all, why are you doing it? Because this kind of music is not on the radio, because it was kind of like a Jamiroquai-ish kind of thing, and white guys playing kind of funky rock pop. And
doing it so well, by the way. I was listening to Songs About Jane on the way over here just to kind of prepare for this interview, and it's an amazing album, and it's also one of these situations where I know it's kind of a cliche where people say, they used to be a great band back when they kind of didn't lose themselves, but in this situation, nothing against Maroon 5, I think they do fantastic stuff for what it is. But Songs About Jane, I think, is the best stuff they ever did. It was the most them. I feel like.
Well, I think there's a lot of fans that would agree with you, because I've spoken with a number of guys in the band, recently and even 3 years ago, and they have noticed that there's a pretty substantial group of fans that are pretty adamant, like, hey, when are you going to make another record like the first one? So,
do you think they will? Because I see some artists like John Mayer going back to kind of like their roots. Do you think Maroon 5 will?
I think it'd be very difficult for them to do it, because first of all, Adam Levine is obviously more of an international star now, just by himself. Mm-hmm. And the last album they made, and even starting with Moves Like Jagger, basically the tracks were written and kind of recorded, and he walked in and just kind of sang on them, and they put it out. So if you look at that amount of time you had to put into having a hit song compared to Songs About Jane, where the band had to write for a couple of years, that we had to rehearse the stuff.
You actually have to know how to play it.
You have to know how to play it. We had to record it. We had to do all the overdubs. We had to mix it. And so there's a lot of time invested in that. And for Adam to just walk into a room and 3 hours later be done and walk out, I mean, that's really the most efficient way to make some money, obviously. And he's just kind of, his ear, I think, is tuned much more towards trying to stay on top of the whole pop, kind of a competition. And that's what he's doing, as opposed to the first record, I think, was an expression of his genuine feelings about mainly one woman, a couple of other women kind of peppered in there. And I think it was just a very different thing. And also he co-wrote with Jesse, the keyboard player, and he co-wrote with James, the guitar player. And I think it was really a group thing that happened there, and they were all kind of contributing their own vibe and personality, which is what makes that record feel multifaceted, because each guy was contributing his own vibe to it. Right. Whereas when Adam has these producers that just basically program and put together all this music, and he walks in and sings it, it's Adam Levine, but it's not really Maroon 5. But again, they've been very, very successful doing it. But so I mean, look, I talked to these guys a few years ago. Hey, let's make a record like the first one. We try to move in that direction, but Adam kind of still wanted to keep doing what he's doing, and I think they're going to try again. But I'm not sure he would ever even be interested in that. I think his whole game now is he's very, very good at picking pop songs. He's very much his own A&R person, his own curator. Yeah. He finds the songs. He goes, "This is the one," and so he's got keen ears for that kind of music.
Yeah. Which is a beautiful, I don't know that I would necessarily call it a beautiful thing. I would say that it's quite a skill, and he's very, very good at it. Yeah. And I guess who are we, or who is anybody to tell somebody else what they should be doing? It's just some part of me that feels like I wish I wish they would go back and record a because it's like, what are you actually chasing at some point? It's like who knows? I'm not a famous person, so I don't know what it would be like to be at that level where you just kind of, you want to just keep the party going. But what was it, 2 years ago that Maroon 5 was playing at the Super Bowl?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember most of the show were Matt Wallace productions.
Yeah. The first 3 songs were mine, which was
that
really
was
nice.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, they're just great songs. They're catchy songs. They're great productions. The song that I remember being on the radio, and I know a lot of them were from Songs About Jane, but This Love. Yeah. So that it starts with a piano. Yeah. Now, was that actually a piano, or was that a sample back then?
That was a piano. That was a real piano. That was a real piano. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think anytime I guess that's okay. So this goes back to our earlier conversation, which is if you have the budget and you're in a studio, and most studios tend to have a decent piano in there, then you record a real piano. Yeah. Or real B3 or whatever it is, or real drums in a room. Sure. And or real guitar amps in a room. I mean, so all that stuff is just that's what happened back then. It's like, oh, here we go, we're going to do piano. Yeah. And of course nowadays, like, oh, we got a good sample, all right, let's just use that.
Right. So. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously so many different directions we could go on this stuff. I'm curious, of all the work you've done, do you have a favorite album?
Oh man.
Or what would be a few that you've that were particularly notable, or maybe that went in a direction that you didn't see coming. Clearly, Songs About Jane was one of those. Yeah. But maybe some other examples of.
Well, I mean, there's different reasons to like records. It is really very, very difficult to pick out, any quote unquote favorites, because they all have different resonances with me. Some artistically are really important. the fact that Faith No More kind of broke through on a genre that was at the time called, rap metal. And prior to that, there was no rap metal on the radio, and no one had heard it. And that band was part of the vanguard of that kind of sound. They subsequently kind of distanced themselves from it. So that was really, gratifying. Maroon 5 obviously is gratifying because I got to work with a band that was unknown on an unknown label, and they just blew up and became a worldwide hit. I mean, I remember having friends who were touring in different countries during that time, and I'd get these like emails like, "Oh, we were in the airport in Sydney, Australia, and we heard This Love." And then someone's like, "Yeah, I'm in Amsterdam, I'm hearing This Love." It's like, oh, that's really something, because that's the first, pretty much only record that I had that was a worldwide smash. Faith No More was certainly a hit in America, a hit in England. I think parts of South America it was. It did kind of break through, but Maroon 5 was everywhere. And I know just because people were emailing me from all parts of the world and just saying, "I'm hearing this song." It's like, okay, well, that sounds like it's a big hit, So that was really, that's pretty much the only time in my career where I had that typical Hollywood experience where Maroon 5 took it to a certain point on Octone label, and then Clive Davis, who was running BMG at the time, he was, from what I understand, he wanted to get a hold of it 6 months earlier, and the label guys held him up, said, "Just give us 6 more months to develop it." But when he got it, he did that, write $1 million check and put it worldwide. And that's one of those moments where someone put the gas in and it just exploded.
Right time, right place.
Everything.
Once you actually produced an awesome record too. I mean, it's like they talk about, examples of things being lucky, and it's like, well, it's opportunity meets preparation, right? Like you guys delivered an incredible record, and the time was right.
But a lot of people deliver incredible records. There are so many incredible records that honestly deserve the same kind of notoriety as Maroon 5. They really do. There's so many people that put out great records, and for whatever reason, the public doesn't catch on. Maybe the management's not together, or the label's not together, or the band's got issues, or they don't tour, whatever it is. But Maroon 5, those guys had, I was with them on the day they got their, I think it was their first gold or platinum record. They were playing at some little get together in Malibu for some clothing company, and they got a plaque, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is almost to the day 10 years since when they started their band Kara's Flowers." So the gestation period for them, in a lot of bands, it's like 8 to 10 years. You start your band, that band falls apart, the guys went to college, they came back, started another band, and 10 years later, they had a huge hit, and same thing with Faith No More. I mean, they were like 8, 9 years into it before they really had the breakthrough, records. So that's just kind of how it goes. You have to really just be tenacious, and you have to find your audience, and that's one of the things that not having as many venues, obviously COVID has affected things. You can't really tour and kind of develop your audience and have face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's changed. Again, just the way you're explaining the way that the Maroon 5 record came together, and all this preparation and rehearsals, and then holding off on the release, and it just it seems like that's not the way that it happens anymore.
Now imagine if they had put that record out 2 years ago with COVID. That record might not have done anything.
Sure.
Because that, and also this, one of the things that's unique about that band is that they are the only band I know that they toured for 4 years on that record.
Wow.
4 years they went after it.
So fucking sick of
they
those
hated
songs.
They hated the songs after a while, and they'd add all these different cover songs. But you tour across the United States trying to get some traction, nothing happens, and you go again, and then you go to England, you come back, and like, okay, we're starting to get traction. Now things are picking up. Let's do it again. Oh, now they want you to go to Australia. Okay, come back home. Oh wait, now they want you to go to Europe, and so. They were just certainly tired of those songs, but it was that kind of thing. It took that long. They were super, super tenacious, which is why that record is now, I think it's close to like 15 million worldwide, which is, I think it was an excellent record, but they toured and they really set the stage. And to be fair, the label really pushed hard and they really did their thing. So everything kind of aligned, all the planets aligned for that one,
So speaking of record labels, I suppose with the Maroon 5 album, but with any of the other artists you've worked with, I know you've done some work with Train, you know, O.A.R, and is it typical for you to get a lot of pressure from the record executive saying, Matt, we want to bring you in as producer, this is kind of what we want you to do, or are they more inclined to say, Matt, we trust your expertise,
right? Well,
just make us something.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of combination of both. It depends on the record label, depends on the head of the label at any given time. Oftentimes, because I have a track record, they know they can expect that we'll at least make a record that's saleable and hopefully it'll take off and and become a hit. But and it's there are times when I think the pressure is usually during the writing of the record, and maybe during the very as I'm courting a band and they're talking to me, that's when the label's like, okay. In fact, usually they won't let the band go forward unless they have the songs written generally. But I've had many times where I've had to go in there and we've had to work on songs and do pre-production and put them into shape, because the Maroon 5 stuff was like they were exceptional choruses, but every one of their demos went verse, chorus, and then guitar solo out. And I was and they'll even say this when I run into them every once in a while. They're like, "Oh, you're the guy who told us to write bridges." Because I said, "Listen, you have an opportunity here. These are great songs, but basically your song peaks at chorus 2, and what are you gonna do? Just do another chorus out?" I said, "If you write a bridge, you have the opportunity to make a much more compelling song, and I think that ultimately you might write some songs that could be covered by other people." And that was actually my big push. Like, you want to have songs that are so good that people want to cover them. Yeah. And so they wrote these bridges, and the bridges are, like in This Love, there's some of the best parts of the song are the bridge.
Awesome bridge,
yeah. And so you get to chorus, you go, okay, how can it get any better? And then it takes that rise, you go, oh my goodness, this is, and then it really just seals the deal. Then you got the chorus out. And so pushing for bridges with O.A.R, they had a song called Shattered. That was their like one of their biggest songs they ever had for radio.
How many times
that one right there. So,
and you recorded that?
Recorded and produced it. But it's interesting when they wanted me to produce them prior to that, and I remember saying to their manager, I said, "Hey, I just don't think they have the songs." He said, "Well, listen, we're going to move forward without you because we think we have the songs." And then I think it was like,
sorry, that was their manager that told you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so then they decided to go off and do something else, and then I think it was like 3 or 5 months later, they said, "Okay, listen, we're ready to go now." And they had Shattered. They'd written Shattered. I said, "Okay, this is a really, really good song." And that was one of those times where, as a producer, even though I really wanted to get to work, I just said, I don't think you're ready to go, and which can certainly upset people at times. Right. So they wrote that song, terrific song. They had another song called Vancouver that ended up becoming a song called This Town. And This Town is the one when we were in this studio and they'd worked on, and they said,
recorded it here.
Yeah, all that stuff we recorded here, and Shattered as well. And they had the song. They said, "Oh, I think it sounds really good." I said, "Yeah, it sounds good, but I think we can do better." And so I kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And I said, "Listen, I want a song." And this is one of the rare moments in my career. I said, "Listen, I want a song that they can play like in stadiums where people are gonna sing it, and it's gonna really
like an anthem."
An anthem. I said, maybe sports teams will pick up a song, but I was really, really, really directed about that one song, and I did a little bit of co-writing on it, and it got to a point where so many different, ESPN, all these sports teams were asking to use it, and I know this from personal experience because they were asking me for permission, and I finally just signed off and said, "Listen." I told my manager who was handling my publishing, I said, "Listen, whatever the O.A.R wants, just yes. They don't need my permission about it," because I only had like 10 or 15% of the publishing. But we accomplished what we had set out to do with that song, and it was played. And so many, and I actually just spoke with Mark Roberts, the singer, about 2 weeks ago. He goes, "We still get requests for that song. It is still being used for college and other sports things because it has this town, it has this anthemic thing to it." And that's exactly what I wanted. I went very, very, very specifically for that kind of thing. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I can speak from some experience here too, that working with you when you did some production work for The Novelist a few years ago, that was truly, and I'm not just saying this to give you compliments here on the podcast, but that was such an incredible experience in a lot of ways, but probably most notably because you basically forced the band to think very specifically about what we were doing with the music. And the attention to detail with the songcraft was something that I found to be extremely valuable, and I continue to, use the things that you taught, and as you're explaining how you doing the same thing with O.A.R and Maroon 5, it's got to be such a fun process as a producer to see a band or an artist and go, man, what can I do to create an environment so that these guys or gals or whoever they are can actually thrive. What are their blind spots maybe, or where could they be better? And I'm sure sometimes it is annoying. I mean, I remember certain things you would say about some of the work we were doing, and it does, you come up with this demo or something like that, and then somebody has the balls to come in there and say, yeah, I don't really like that one, or that's not as good, or this could be better, and you're kind of like, what the hell are you talking about? I think it's a pretty damn good song, but But ultimately, that's what you need to hear. You don't need to just get a pat on the back. You need to know, like, how can we do better? You know, and what is working, and what should I keep? You know, what should I drive further?
Yeah, for better or for worse, the producer is the first goalie you have to get past. And if the producer is doing his or her job, they will find the weak moments in your songs, and the songwriting, the arrangements, the whatever it is, the key, the tempo of the song, the performance. And you need someone like that who can find it, who has your ultimately your best interest at heart. A lot of bands have a hard time realizing this, that when producers get in there, I mean, for most of them, some can be Svengali and they want to have their kind of vibe or their stamp on it. But generally, all the producer wants is the very best possible recording of excellent songs they can get from an artist or a band. That's all we ever want. We don't want anything more than that. And so you have this person who's like, hang on a second, these songs aren't good enough. It's like, what do you mean? You know? And the thing of it is, I always say to artists, I go, listen, if I don't find your weak songs, the label's going to hopefully find them. And if they don't find them, it goes out to the public and they'll find them, and then it's a record.
It's too late,
Yeah. And so you need someone that goes, hey, I think we can make this a little bit better. And that's a really difficult thing. You know, and I explained to people, I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you and Joel, but I remember this came to my mind actually during working on This Town by O.A.R, where literally for 2 or 3 days, the song was like in pieces. Like we had a song that was like 75%, 80% sounded just fine.
Half a verse here.
Yeah, and it was just in pieces. And one of the biggest difficulties as a producer is when you go, okay, guys, we're done for the night. We're going to pick up tomorrow. And the thing is just, it's like it's not as good as it was. It's not 75, 80%, and now it's like a it's an F- version of a song, and everyone's looking at you like, dude, it was okay before, it was fine. You know, it's like, I know, but we don't want fine, we want great. Yeah. And so you have to have this belief and momentum. You go, hey, we're going to be fine tomorrow. And then of course you go home as a producer like, what the hell am I going to do? Jesus, what are we going to do? And so sometimes you have a day or two like that where people have to put their faith in you, and then you finally break on through. Yeah. So I remember coming up with this vision of how to explain the process of being a producer in terms that aren't musical. Okay, so you and I and a bunch of people are on it. Let's say you and I and the novelist are on an island. We're hanging out. It's a little island. It's nice enough. Has some coconuts. Has a decent beach. And we're all hanging out. And you guys, hey, this is great. I go, yeah, it's pretty good, you know, but, and you're like, what do you mean, but? I go, well, there's this bridge that goes off into the mist up there. I don't know. I think there might be a better island up there. And you're like, well, what do you mean? I go, and you're like, well, what does it look like? I go, I'm not really sure. But I don't know if this island, awesome. I think there might be something better than this island. You're like, well, it's sunny. We got coconuts. And Joel's like, yeah, man, we got palm trees. Everything's cool, man. I'm like, come on, let's get on this bridge. So you and I were on the bridge. You know, we're going up in the Saints into the mist. Can't see anything. And we're kind of halfway through. And it's like kind of a rickety bridge. And Joel's like, come on, man, let's just go back, man. Coconuts were fine back there, you know. And you're like, come on, Joel. So we're going up there. And all of a sudden, like, there's a wind coming. And the bridge is swaying. You can hear the water rushing below. And you're like, hey, Matt, listen, I agree with Joel, man. Like, screw this. Let's go back, because that island was totally fine, you know. Yeah. And you're like, you know, the wind's coming. You're like, hey, Matt, like, what does it look like? Because why are we doing this, man? This is crazy. I'm like, come on, guys, it's really going to be better, I think. You know, like, and we go up there. And so finally we come up through, and the clouds part, and there's like this nicer island. There's papaya and guava, and there's like a little thatched hut, and there's like a nicer, bigger beach. And you guys are like, love it. Oh, this is great. And you guys are like, why did you tell us it looked like
Matt.
this? Yeah. why did you tell us it looked like this? It's like, well, I didn't know that it would look like this.
Right.
I just knew that where we came from wasn't good enough.
Yes. And would you say that that's something you've always had an intuitive sense?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes. I've always been an arranger producer.
So you fell into the right career then.
I've always been an arranger producer. The one thing that I do better than anything I do, and that is, and I've run to artists I've worked with, they go, yeah, it's amazing. I walked in with this one song, and I walked in with 2 songs, and you go, okay, that one's got great verses, but crappy choruses. This one's got really good choruses. Just put them together. And he even said at the time, he's like, fuck you. What are you going to do to my songs? You can't do that. And he goes, you know what? And he goes, that night, I remember I went home and I did what you said. And I was like, he's absolutely right. And this is a guy this is from 30 years ago. And we just met up a couple weeks ago. He goes, you're absolutely right. You saw the good chunks of one song, the good chunks of another. And instead of having 2 mediocre songs, cannibalize them and put together an excellent song.
Yeah. I actually think that you, looking back on some of the stuff we do with a novelist, I think you actually had some suggestions of exactly that technique. And some of those songs are still some of the songs that we're developing from that technique, I actually still have in a notebook somewhere. So maybe I need to revisit them. But yeah, that's it's just such an interesting. And also as a producer, of course, you are coming into this situation without any preconceived ideas or knowledge of the song. Anyway, because I can tell you as a songwriter, you write the song, you work and you perform it a bunch of times, and you feel like any changes to it, it's almost like they're telling your child that it's it's not quite right.
Yeah.
But you don't see that, because what you see is just I didn't know anything about this song before. You played me the song.
Yeah.
These are my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, there's a couple of things here. One is it's really interesting. Sometimes I work with bands and they want to talk about who wrote what. It's like, I don't really care who wrote what.
Yeah.
I don't want to know who wrote what.
Because you don't want to have any biases involved?
Of course not.
Yeah.
Because what if I get along with you more famously than Joel?
Right. Yeah.
But he's got a better song.
It's just a conflict.
And then I'm like, I like hanging out with Eric, but man, the song Joel has, so I was like, I don't really care who wrote what. I don't even want to know. Because all I want to do is find the very best songs. And if 8 of the best songs are Joel's songs and only 2 years, well, I'm really sorry.
Right.
But my job is to make the best album.
Right. Yeah.
Okay? I need to make the best album with the available funds and available songs you have.
Yeah.
Now if you come to me and you won the lottery and you have 10 songs, you don't care. Like, hey, I'm going to hire you to make a record. And
Passion project.
Yeah, passion project.
Different than
it's
like
my stuff.
Right.
It's like, great, we're going to do all your
do
songs.
that, yeah.
But if you say, okay, I really want to get my songs on here, but I also want the best songs. I'll say, okay, here's what: co-write with a couple of people, get some potential like focus tracks or singles, have 5 of your songs, 5 that are co-writes, boom, win and win.
There we go.
You know what I mean? Because you're still writing all the songs, Yeah. And by the way, there are numerous artists who become successful by doing cover songs.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
And also just remember, there's a story where, where you talk to bands, where they go, this song, like with you guys, oh my God, this song, man, we already have like 1,000 people in Reno who love this song, and like if we were talking right now today with you guys in the band, I go, okay, let's get a map of the United States. All right, let's find Reno. Okay, there's Reno. Okay, now let's zoom out. Okay, see everything other than Reno. That's where
There's
I want.
like a few other states, aren't there?
There are a few other states. And so the thing is, bands do have this very myopic view where, but if we change these songs, the people in Reno are going to get upset because they like the way the chorus is right now. That's really great.
So what? Yeah.
But I think that's the difference, that I'm thinking nationally and internationally. That's what I'm thinking. And you guys are thinking Reno, we're in Reno and we don't want to lose our Reno. It's like, listen, you may lose 500 people in Reno if you change the song. You might. Yeah. But I'm betting that you're going to gain 500,000 around the world. And that's really, really important. People just have to really, take that into account.
Right. It's interesting indeed. So you worked on some music with Train as well, right? What did you do with
I worked on their very first album. They had pretty much self-produced, or I think they worked with somebody when they did most of that record, and I was called in to produce a few extra songs and then also to mix the singles. So that's what I did. So I mixed Meet Virginia. There's a song called Free.
Oh, right on.
Some other stuff, and I produced some stuff. So yeah. So anyway, it was really cool.
Some of my favorite tracks from the band.
Thanks.
Indeed.
Yeah. And they're really cool. So I worked with them early on, and they're really cool. Hard. Oh my God, if you ever want to see one of the hardest working bands in show business, that band, I worked with them. They came through town. I think we had to do some recording, and there's 5 guys in a van, smaller than your van.
Yeah.
The low ceiling van. Whatever, 12 or 15 passenger van. Yeah. And I'm like, hey man, great to see you guys. Thanks for working on this stuff. Where you guys going? Oh, we're going on tour. We're going to be in tour for like 6 months across the States. Oh, wow, man. Well, that's pretty good. And 2 of the guys like, it's good, except our wives are having babies at home while we're on tour. So that band gave everything to make it. And some of the guys missed being there for their kids' births. So, and the unfortunate thing, whether you're in the music business or the movie business or you travel for a living or whatever you do, sometimes you aren't able to be present to either maintain friendships, maintain marriages or relationships, be around for your kids' first, second, third birthdays. And so yes, you can become very, very successful, and be very well known around the world. And what you give up, that's the question. And that's the question about any job you do is what do you want?
Yeah.
And how much are you willing to give up to achieve it?
Right. Yeah, that's well put. We were talking this morning, and it's sort of on the topic of just information music content overload. Just with music, we're talking about Spotify and Apple Music, and there's just a deluge of stuff that's out there. We were talking a little bit about just kind of the state of the world, and obviously what the pandemic has done to definitely, I would say it's fair to say, make the state of the world much more uneasy than it was previously, and just the unfortunate forces that certainly we're seeing in the United States and around the world, where you can essentially create whatever confirmation bias reality you want, and the internet is driving this, social media is driving this. What sort of is there a place for music to maybe mitigate that? In your opinion, and I guess as creative people, as a producer, as a songwriter myself, like, how do you see your role, if you see your role, in, I guess, making the world a better place? Because it sure seems like we kind of need that positive energy, and maybe more than ever. Right.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, here's there's a lot of different answers for that. One is the decision about what to write and sing about really has to come from the artist and the band. So if he or she or they want to write something political, then they can certainly do it. And you can couch it in a pop song or a love song if you want. And for me, I mean, obviously I can't really direct anybody in any direction to go in. Although I will say I did work with Eric Gales, who's this phenomenal blues guitar player who's one of the...
I checked out some of his stuff on your recommendation.
His playing is... I've never worked with anybody at that level of a musician who could play everything and anything, and has such an amazing view on how to take a guitar and go from blues to playing stuff that's almost like orchestrated and melodic and really, really beautiful. And we tracked that in here. Here's an example of a band. In 3 days, we had the drummer in the booth, bass player and Eric in here, and we cut that thing live, and it just had just fire and passion. So I know it's kind of a roundabout answer, but he did have a couple of lyrics that were probably a little more pointed on the racial lines. I'm like, yeah, you should sing that. Yeah. And I think so. That was one of those moments where I couldn't say to him, you should sing this lyric. But when he had some lyrics that were kind of on that tip, I said, you should absolutely do it. And I think for him, it was really, I can't speak for him, but I remember having the feeling that he was surprised that, I as a white man would be like, yeah, you got to sing about this race thing, and that white people can be the devil sometimes. Yeah, you should definitely do that. And I'm not saying that he said that in his lyric. I'm just saying that aesthetic. So
he had something to say about his own experience that you wanted to encourage rather than censor.
Absolutely, right. And I could tell because I think it was an alternate lyric or something like that, or I talked about a lyric. I go, this lyric isn't that strong. I don't know what it really means, and it doesn't resonate with me. Then he came up with a lyric. I go, that's what we're talking about. It was just really like, wow. It was really, really powerful. So to me, that's, I guess, as a producer, I want to encourage the very, very best that each artist or band can be at their core, whether it's going to be the best pop songwriters or if they want to say something that has some more meaning to it. I really want to encourage that and support it and say, let's go, let's record it, let's make the best version we can of that.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly well put. I think that music, as musicians and producers and creative people, there's so many different versions of creativity you can put out there, and I know that you're talking about your own musical preferences. Sometimes it's more angsty, sometimes it's more just the pretty kind of beautiful pop music stuff, and I would share that sentiment for sure. I'm noticing even in my own writing, it's like sometimes I'm in the mood for something that's just kind of nice and pretty, and other times I feel like, I don't know if I would necessarily say a responsibility to say something maybe maybe that it carries a little more weight. As we were talking about this morning, it brings me back to the conversation breakfast, though. There's certain I don't know which artist this was that you were mentioning, but you were impressed by the fact that they would basically pose the questions. They weren't necessarily preachy, but they were addressing certain topics. Who was that?
Okay.
Was it a musician, or we were talking about so much this morning?
Let's see. They posed a question. I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, yeah. Actually, yes, I know what you're talking about. So Russell Brand has this thing that he does on YouTube, and I have to say he's really impressive for a number of reasons. One, he's exceptionally intelligent and articulate. And this is a guy who did everything he possibly could to just damage his brain with drug addiction and alcoholism and everything, and he is so incredibly focused. He's very, very well read. He does a lot of research. And the thing that's really unique about him that I think puts him in the 0.1 percentile is that he'll bring out a certain subject. He'll talk about all the information he has about it. He goes, it doesn't matter what I think. What do you think about it? What are your thoughts?
I love that.
Put them in the comments. I want to know what you, my listeners, think about it. And I've never ever heard him say, he never has an agenda, and he never pushes his listeners to agree with him. Number one, and number two, follow his own thoughts. He goes, no, what do you think? And that is so refreshing and invigorating to see somebody like that. And he's, like I say, he's really smart about it.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's an approach that I, as a listener and I guess a consumer of various types of content, I definitely appreciate more. There's nothing worse to me than whoever it might be, but particularly a musical artist who's basically saying, "This is ground truth. This is how it is, and let me tell you what you should and shouldn't be doing with your life and your behavior." Yeah. There's just a certain hubris to it, and I feel like we're seeing that in unprecedented volume on the internet these days. And like we were talking about this morning, it's like whether it's extreme right or extreme left or any version in between, there are a lot of people that seem to be very, very angry, and frankly, I think a lot of the anger is entirely justified. But I guess I see a world that's not necessarily some parts of these more extreme movements. It doesn't even seem like they want to reconcile. It seems like they just want to.
Well, I think a lot of people want to keep the propaganda going. They don't want to reconcile it because whether it's Fox News or CNN or anybody, whether they're Republican or Democratic, they want to keep pushing their agenda because they have more eyeballs on the screen, they have more listeners, and they can sell more advertising. Right. And I'm a liberal Democrat, but I just think we've been pitted against each other. Yeah. And as we were saying at breakfast today, I really believe, as much as I don't adhere to most of what I think most Republicans, certainly conservative Republicans, are kind of pushing for, I do believe that there are bigger powers that are working to pit us against each other. Because if I'm angry at Republicans and they're angry at Democrats, the people who are really in control, who want to do whatever they want to do, are getting away with fucking murder. Right. And I think the fact that there's a couple things. One is the fact that during the pandemic, the only people to not only survive but thrive are the wealthiest, who have made trillions of dollars. And if that doesn't tell you that a system is rigged, where people can make money during a pandemic while other people are losing jobs, where that's a big indicator. I think our country, which is supposed to be like by the people, for the people, of the people, I think is the biggest bunch of crap nowadays, because I think it's really run by corporations. And what little I know is that if you have lobbyists for your corporation that can talk to people who are politicians and actually shape what kind of rules and laws that we have, and they can just make more and more money with their business. I mean, I think the thing that many Americans agree on is, one, Medicare should be able to choose, have some input on what the price of prescription medication. That's number one. 75% of Americans believe that. Republicans, Democrats, whatever, they still can't put that through.
Right.
Why? Because the lobbyists have the ear of the people who are the politicians. And same thing with Americans, same thing, 75%. Hey, corporations should have a fair tax, absolutely, more than they're paying. And people who are super wealthy should be taxed, Yeah. I pay more taxes than people who are trillionaires. Right. And so I think that Americans agree with that, and you think your vote's going to matter. But basically, once the politicians get a hold of it, if they're being paid by wealthy people, by corporations, then they're not going to push through that kind of reform or change. And so this whole idea, I think it's of and by corporations, and that's my biggest frustration. Yeah. And those people want us to be fighting, Republican, Democrat. They want us to keep fighting each other. Right. Because if you punch each other across instead of punching up, that's where the problem is. Yeah. I mean, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I completely agree, and I think it's also it's a function of a system that it's designed to perpetuate itself. So and I guess the $1 million question is like, how is it possible to interrupt it, to actually have some real change? And that's not to say that, I mean, it generally still works as much as there's dysfunction. I mean, we do have roads and hospitals, and we're not living in the dark ages, but there's so many aspects to the way that it functions. It's really
I think they should take money out of politics. I think there should be no such thing as lobbyists, or at the very least, then all regular Americans should start their own lobby, and then we should lobby against the corporations, because I think that they're just running ripshot over everybody. Anyway,
it's corrupt. Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah,
it is corrupt.
So
and it's come up, whether it's Democrat or Republican, you hear about these things where these, senators have been doing trading now, where they know what's going to happen. They know what policies are changing, and they can actually go, oh, I want to buy these stocks and those stocks because I know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And this has
and
come
if
up
that's
numerous
not
times.
rigged, come on. What is
It's
it?
absolutely rigged.
Exactly.
Democrat, Republican, same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to feel pretty disenfranchised with the whole thing. And I think as much as I'm a Democrat, I think even that's a bunch of propaganda too.
I agree. I mean, I've certainly been pretty public about my loathing of Donald Trump, but that doesn't. People confuse that sometimes as saying that I'm like carrying the torch for the Democratic Party, or that somehow I think Joe Biden is the next best thing or something like that. And these are not true statements. But we're definitely in a situation where we don't have a lot of great choices in the political arena, which is unfortunate. But Matt, you've been super generous with your time today. What else is?
There's some more questions. I was gonna say one thing that's good out of the pandemic, and that is my daughter Amelia, who worked at Urban Outfitters, and so she was working, and then the pandemic came in, and she could only work like 1 day a week, so she was getting paid unemployment. And ever since she was in kindergarten, she would write these lyrics down. She had a song called Punk Rock Princess when she was in kindergarten. So a year before pandemic, she said, hey, I want to know about how do you work with artists when they give you lyrics. So I sat down, I said, well, get rid of this, put that there, repeat this. She said, okay. So a year later, pandemic hits, she goes, I want to do a song. And she and I started doing songs. And one of the most joyful production projects I've ever worked on has been with her, because we'll whip out a song really, really quickly. I mean, just we sit down in 3 or 4 hours, like we got it. Like I'll show her, I'll put pieces of tape on the keyboard so she can play the chords and she'll play the drum parts. But some really, really incredible music, unexpectedly so, because she's never been an artist. I showed her how to play guitar when she was like in middle school, and she hasn't played since. But it's really interesting to hear her come up with these melodies, come up with the lyrics. I'm also finding that she was obviously didn't have as happy a childhood as I thought she did in terms of keeping friends and things like that, but just stunning, beautiful songs. She wrote these songs, put them together, made her own videos, and she got herself on iTunes and Spotify. Anyway, I'm going to give a shameless shout out to Gentle Jupiter. Oh, that's her thing, Gentle Jupiter, and she has incredible music.
That's her artist name.
That's her artist name, Gentle Jupiter, all lowercase, and just stunning music and really cool videos. It's all by herself. She just did it in her room, and she and her boyfriend would go film these things.
That's awesome.
But really, really good songs, just like really stunning. Cool. So, anyway,
cool. That's fantastic. Well, she learned from the best.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what's on the horizon for Matt Wallace these days. What are you working on?
Question. Well, I'm still producing a little bit here and there, and I'm still mixing. But the biggest thing is I'm doing this Atmos mixing, Dolby Atmos, which is basically surround sound. I've got a 7.2.4 system, which means 7 speakers at ear volume,
which are what we see here, right?
Around here, yes. And there's 2 subwoofers, and there's 4 speakers above.
Okay.
And so it's basically surround sound.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, so when you listen to the mixes, it's around you. It's basically called immersive audio, and Apple's really been pushing it. It's now available on like Amazon and Apple, and so if you're in a room, it sounds incredible. But they also were able to fold it down to what's called binaural on your headphones. So when you listen, it sounds like it's a little bit from around beyond the headphones. Yeah, they're still refining.
How in the world are they able to do that?
Who knows? And the technology is getting better and better. So we're mixing for the actual room with the speakers. We fold it down. So eventually, in time, those programs are going to get better and better at replicating with just 2 headphones, a pair of headphones, like the sound around you. It's pretty amazing, and it's incredible.
Wow.
So yeah, and Apple's starting to require it too. A lot of artists, if you want any kind of like prominence in their, on their site, you have to be able to provide Atmos. So I'm doing a lot of catalog work right now for labels, just doing that. So that's been really pretty terrific.
Remixing older stuff.
Yeah.
So where do you even start with that? I mean, do you have some sort of template? Because I'm thinking if you're just doing a stereo mix, I mean, it's not just a stereo mix. That's already like there's just an infinite amount of decisions, especially now that we have limitless plugins. Yeah. But now you're going to 7 speakers. Like, how do you even? I mean, what is your process like there?
Well, that's a really good perceptive question. First of all, some of the times we just work from stems, which means we have multiple stereo stems. One's just keyboards, one's guitars, whatever. And so we just kind of place it in the sound field. But sometimes,
like you might put piano left here and piano right there.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want with it. It's really something. Yeah, you can have sound coming from behind you, but sometimes we have to actually replicate the original stereo mix. Like we did the B-52 stuff, we had to replicate the stereo mix, and then from there open it up to Atmos. Now, there's a couple of challenges. One is we're so used to stereo because when we see concerts and bands, it's in front of us in stereo. When we listen in our home speaker systems, it's kind of in stereo. So now you're used to that, and then you're taking the sound, you're kind of spreading it around you. Now the ambience you can put around you, and that makes it feel kind of larger than life, which is really nice. But then when you move instruments, it does take some getting used to.
Like you could put a drum set like around you.
I can put the drum set above.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really crazy. But the interesting thing is that I think what a lot of us who are doing Atmos are realizing that in the days of stereo, it took a lot of effort to jam an entire band and all the vocals and
Into
all
left
whatever
and right.
in left and right.
Yeah.
It was really, really, really challenging.
Well, and you necessarily lose stuff in a thick
course you
mix.
do, yeah.
It's just no way to hear everything.
Yeah, so now with Atmos, you actually can pan it out. So actually you can hear the band, but you go,
That
oh yeah,
is
there's
wild.
some keyboards behind me, or there's some background vocals, and it does give you more space, and it does open it up, and it makes it, you don't have to like kind of squeeze and like, wrench things into a shape. Now it's like, oh, it feels more natural. And in some ways I've had some more kind of emotional feeling mixes that way where you can really get the sense of bands. I did a Replacements thing that an album I remixed a few years ago that I got to do in Atmos, and it's just gorgeous to hear. I mean, first of all, there are a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, and so you can hear you can hear more of the personality of the band, and you can hear their little asides and their funny background vocals and their guitar parts, and it just feels like there's the band. Whereas the released version feels very cleaned up,
And do you mean
homogenized.
of this Replacements album itself, or you're just talking in general? You're saying?
Oh,
just
I'm
in
saying
general?
Replacements album specifically because I think that when it was mixed for release, 20, 30 years ago, it was really cleaned up, and they got rid of all the loose ends and stuff like that, and they kind of just give it a big good sheen, and and so it just sounds, it's more artificial and less genuine. And the mix I've done now sounds like it's like you're in the room with the band, and it feels
so
honest, and it feels
That's so cool.
genuine. It feels much more compelling to me. And when that record in particular, people really were mad at me because they thought I ruined the band because it sounded so slick. I said, I had nothing to do with the mixing. I just produced it. And so a few years ago, it was a once in a career opportunity where they allowed me to mix that record the way I envisioned it. And so I mixed it in stereo. The first time in 30 years, I did it just the way we want it, and it sounds incredible. Now putting it into this Dolby Atmos, it sounds really nice because you can really get a sense of the artist. It's really nice.
That is amazing.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much of this is going to translate to most people's listening because this is active listening.
Yeah.
You're sitting there and paying attention, whereas most people have earbuds and they're doing stuff and
They're
don't
at the
really,
gym, yeah.
they're doing other stuff. So generally,
Yeah.
we have music as wallpaper, but at least now this wallpaper is going to wrap around you instead of just being like these two sheets. It's going to go like around. You're going to feel like, oh, this is bigger and fuller. So it's kind of nice.
Who knows though? But as the technology for the listening systems and headphones advances,
It's going to.
Who knows? I mean, maybe 5 years from now you'll be able to have an experience like that. Maybe you put some sort of helmet on or
Oh
something.
yeah.
Who
Well,
knows?
I think they're improving the algorithms every year, and I do
Yeah.
think within a few years, even just regular stereo headphones are going to sound much, much better.
Yeah.
Because we've already seen a leap forward from even a couple years ago, and they're starting to do these home systems that you set up, and they have these upward firing speakers, and so you do get a sense, and you can put a satellite, and you can get a sense of the surround sound. So.
Yeah.
It's coming. It's coming. Then once they refine it for headphones, it's like, wow, you can really hear much more detail, and things just sound, it sounds like you're in a space,
Yeah, which is obviously as somebody who's mixing music and a producer, and I can relate to this as an artist too. It's like that stuff is so exciting because we put so much time and energy into a song and a mix and a production and arrangement.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes it's sort of depressing how it's like, somebody has their ear pods on and they're on the treadmill and they're listening to this and you're like, but you didn't hear that the guitar was panned to the right at the pre-chorus? And I mean, what the hell are you talking about?
Civilians don't even care about that.
I know I probably just need to relax on this a little bit. Whenever I have any new song or mix or anything like that, and people that are close to me that I want to share the mix with, I'm like, and for fuck's sake, please at least listen to it on decent headphones or in a nice system or something like that, but
They don't care about it.
No, I know.
Because it just, look, when I go back to my childhood, when I would walk to my friend's house, I would walk into the bedroom and we'd be actually literally walking on the 45 singles. We would walk right across and we'd go, what should we listen to? Oh, let's pick it up. It wasn't even in a sleeve. Just like, oh yeah, put on the turntable. You put the needle down. You put a quarter on it so it stays and so it doesn't jump out of the groove and this and that. And you still get off on it. And and people argue about how MP3s don't sound good. It's like, dude, a great song well performed will transcend any technology.
Yeah.
And people just want to get.
It's much more important. I mean, you can have
vibe.
the highest fidelity mix of a piece of shit, and it's still a piece of shit.
It's still a piece of shit.
Yeah.
And I remember, when I was getting started in record production and engineering, I'd like mix these, like, everything just sounds pristine, the snare drum, and I'd play to my girlfriend at the time, and she like, I don't really like the song. I go, but listen to that snare drum, listen to this. She goes, yeah, I don't like the song, and that's that. People just want to get off, and if the artist could connect their brains to each person, you wouldn't even need music. You wouldn't need poetry, you wouldn't need dance, you wouldn't need sculpture, you wouldn't need painting, because you would just convey the emotion. But the arts are the only way that humans can convey emotions in a way that is palatable and understandable, that isn't exactly direct, like when someone just tells you something, but it just kind of oozes into you, and then you get these feelings. And I always joke with people, like when they have that kind of like orchestrated kind of sad music in movies, that's really just a cue for boneheaded guys to put their arm around whoever they're with, their girlfriend or boyfriend, and go, oh, this is that moment I'm supposed to be like, oh yeah, because otherwise sometimes us guys are just boneheaded, and it's hard for guys because we're taught not to be emotional or not to cry, and so sometimes we need cues from things like movies or reading a passage in a book or certain songs where you just get overwhelmed with the emotion, and you feel you're allowed to express it.
Yeah, for sure.
Whereas if you were just in a room with someone going, oh, I feel really bad about whatever, that, come on, man, be cool. But if you're like, listen to a song, you start crying, you might not even be crying about the song. You might be crying about an emotion that's been opened up inside you.
That it's triggered. Right.
Absolutely triggered.
Yeah, I still have this experience when I'm not listening to a ton of radio these days, but if I'm just listening to a Apple Music or Spotify playlist or for some way a song will come on that I haven't heard in a long time, particularly if it's a song that was played a lot when I was in high school or middle school, when you have these really formative years about developing your musical tastes. The nostalgia is unbelievable. And for some reason, I don't know if other people would report the same experience, but I don't have as powerful a response to new music now as I did when I was a teenager. It doesn't mean I don't have a response. I can still have a strong response. I don't know if it's something about being in those formative years, or maybe it's a function of what we're talking about before, how we're just inundated with all this stuff now. I mean, back in the 90s or 2000s, there were only a few radio stations, relatively speaking. And if you had a song on the radio, like, everybody knew the song.
Yes.
They might not like it. Right. They might have strong opinions about it, but there was more of a shared experience. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's one of the things that's actually not so good for society is that, we have all of these different types of music and political talk shows and things you can experience. And on the one hand, it's a beautiful thing, but we don't have as much of a shared experience anymore, and it makes it very difficult to communicate and to agree.
I think you're right. I think your point is well taken, that there was a time when radio was much more curated by record labels, and so we did have certain songs. Everyone knew the top 20 or top 40 songs, whether you liked them or not, and you could at least talk about it. And it was shared. Where nowadays it's so dispersed, and diverse, because you got Amazon's got music out there, Apple does, Spotify, everyone does. So it's really hard to kind of go, have you heard this certain band? Like, no, I haven't heard that. But have you heard the band? No, I haven't heard that one either. But
that conversation could go on forever.
Absolutely, because there's nothing that's going to funnel all this stuff into a narrower bandwidth where you can hear it. And now with 40,000 songs a day just on Spotify,
it's crazy. Right, and the record labels used to all be known for a certain style of music, and you maybe certainly back in my parents' generation, they might buy a record that they didn't even really know anything about. They just knew that the record label had its own reputation, and they knew it was worth buying. Yeah,
like Motown. People knew when they bought Motown, they knew what they were getting.
And it was exciting, probably. There was more of an anticipation. But
and certainly it was more about rock. Some things were more about funky stuff or rhythm and blues, that kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. It's just hard with fewer curators to really narrow it. I guess there's playlists now on Spotify, which can be good, but it's just it's hard to stand around the water cooler at work and go, hey, have you heard the new such and such an album? It's like,
the answer is almost certainly no.
Almost. Whereas in the old days, it's like, oh yeah, I bought that last week. Totally. It'd be more of a, like you say, more of a shared experience.
Well, Matt, this has been an awesome conversation.
Thank you.
It's so awesome to see you again. It's
Good to see you
hopefully
too.
it won't be another few years.
That'd be good.
One last thing we should actually mention to the listeners is if people want to learn more about Matt Wallace, if they want to work with Matt Wallace, where should they go to learn more about you?
You can Google me. My manager's Frank McDonough at mcdman.com.
Okay.
Try that. But yeah, just get a hold of Eric. He knows how to get a hold of me. And thank you for the opportunity to do this too. I really appreciate
Absolutely,
you taking
Matt.
the time to
Yes.
bring your gear, come up
course.
with the questions,
Yes.
and be interested and involved. And so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's a total joy.
Yeah,
thanks so
thanks.
much, Matt.
Woohoo!
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations for Convergence. If you enjoyed the episode and would like to support the show or any of my musical endeavors, please head over to erichenryanderson.com/mailing list. That's Anderson ending in SEN and sign up. I'm in the process of creating a fan-supported platform through Patreon, which I'll be launching in early 2023. So the best way to make sure you don't miss that announcement is to join my mailing list. You can also follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Eric Henry Anderson, and on Twitter at EH Anderson Music.